Good afternoon, class. For today's lecture, I just wanted to talk a bit about our reading for the week, which is the short story titled The Things They Carried from the collection of short stories also titled The Things They Carried. Just a bit of context and further information about the book before I dive into some of the symbols and some of the questions that are related to our reading. In my own research for the book, I came across a lecture that Tim O'Brien was giving to a group of college students. And I assume this will be similar to the presentation he does with us here at CSU Pueblo. And in that lecture, he was talking about the things they carried being a fictitious account based on his real experience in the Vietnam War. And something that he explained was how subjective truth can be. And I thought it was very interesting because he went on to explain how um, what is true for one person in one part of the world may be different for someone else from a different culture or another part of the world. Or he even talked about how um, things that we hold to be true now, maybe we didn't in earlier moments of our lives, or things when we were younger that we used to hold to be true, maybe we don't find to be true any longer. So I thought that was really interesting, his take on the truth and the accuracy of the novel. And as an English major and somebody that's read literature all my life, I've always said that if a story feels true and it's written in such a way that you connect with it as a human being and find it to be real and truthful, then I don't think it really matters whether the story is a fictitious tale or an accurate account of something that happened. And so I find that to be the case here with Tim O'Brien's novel and collection of short stories. Is just the way he writes his images, his details. It just feels so raw and real that I find this to be true, whether it's a fictitious account or not. So, moving forward from there, I love the style in which this book is written. Just a few personal takeaways for me as I read this book, so I don't go to English professor in this lecture. I just love the style in which Tim O'Brien writes. I feel like this is a very image-driven short story. The things they carried. I love some of the images that he leaves the reader with. One in particular that just stood out to me, which maybe isn't one of the more well-known images of this story, is when Ted Lavender's body is being flown away. He gives the image of the other soldiers in the platoon smoking his weed as he's being lifted and carried away. And for some reason, that image just really stuck out to me. And it kind of, I think, also goes back to some of the questions with the assigned reading for this week and how the soldiers cope and deal with the war, and particularly how they deal with death. And I just think that's a perfect image of the difficulty that these soldiers are faced with in dealing with the horror that surrounds them and dealing with death and the magnitude of war itself, to where their reaction after one of their fellow soldiers dying is to immediately go through his things and start smoking his weed, and even to do that as they're watching him being lifted away, which kind of speaks to these soldiers being desensitized in a way to the death that surrounds them, where it's become normal. And maybe the reactions of one person to death might not be the same as another person. And I don't have any personal experience with war, but I think I can understand how, going back to one of the questions for the assigned reading again, how different soldiers deal with death differently. I could see how you might want to emotionally detach yourself from what's going on around you as a way to move forward and as a way to carry out your job. If you react emotionally to everything that happens, if you connect with humanity in such a way where death has a profound effect on you, it might prevent you from carrying out your job. and ensuring your own life and the lives of those around you. So again, I just thought that was a really profound image, one that stood out to me. And I just find this to be a very image driven short story. And I'm huge on imagery and short stories, and think it could be a very effective tool in expressing larger themes that the writer is trying to get across to readers. So, another question that goes with the assigned reading for this week is why Tim O'Brien keeps coming back to Martha and Ted Lavender's death throughout the chapter. And I remember reading this chapter for the first time. I found myself wondering as a reader, why does he keep coming back to Martha? Why does he keep coming back to Jimmy Cross's love for Martha? There must be a reason for that he wants us to get as readers. And so the more I thought about it, the more I thought about Martha symbolizing Jimmy Cross's connection back to home. And then beyond that, something I found interesting when I was reading for the first time too is how obsessed Lieutenant Jimmy Cross is with Martha being a virgin. And he wonders and is obsessed with wanting to know whether or not she is still a virgin. And I always wondered why Tim O'Brien, the writer, who we can also consider the narrator, and again, the narrator is a fictitious character too. Um, but I kept wondering, why is Jimmy Cross? I mean, that seems like a normal thing, I guess, for a young man to be obsessed with their love interest and whether or not they're still a virgin. But I thought there had to be a reason why he keeps coming back to her virginity. And the more I thought about it, um, the more you could argue that virginity here symbolizes innocence. And again, back to Lieutenant Cross's connection to the real world being Martha and the fact that she's a virgin. I feel like it symbolizes the innocence and the innocent lives that these soldiers have left behind in their home in the United States. And we don't really get the ages of these soldiers in this chapter, but a lot of the soldiers that fought during the Vietnam War were in their late teens and early 20s. And so many of these young men prior to going to the Vietnam War were living very innocent lives back home. And so I thought that was a big symbol in this first chapter, in which Tim O'Brien will come back to throughout the book, is this idea of innocence lost. And in reading other analyses of this book, I came across a really interesting point by one writer in which he brought up the image of Lieutenant Cross fantasizing about Martha and talking about one particular date that they went on at the movie theater and just wanting to touch her knee, and how he wished that later that night he would have taken her back to his room and tied her up just so he could touch her knee all night. And so it's really interesting when you think about that particular image or fantasy. You have this contrast of innocence versus violence, where Lieutenant Cross wants to tie her up, but at the same time, all he wants to do is touch her knee all night. And so I think you could say that symbolizes his mind being torn at this time between the violence that surrounds him and in his current situation in Vietnam versus the innocent life that he left behind. And again, I feel like Martha symbolizes that, not only that connection to home, but also innocence and innocence lost. And it makes sense when you think about the repetition of Tim O'Brien coming back to her being a virgin and Jimmy Cross being obsessed with that. Um, Another symbol, again, going back to that question, why does Tim O'Brien keep coming back to Ted Lavender's death? And it's interesting because we get Ted Lavender's death from different perspectives and different accounts throughout the chapter, and we get even characters' different reactions to it. And so I think something we can take away from this chapter is just how Ted Lavender's death symbolizes how sudden and arbitrary death in time of war can be. And we get that through Kiowa's reaction to Ted Lavender's death, where he can't get over the fact that it just happened so suddenly. And he goes on to describe how he just fell like a rock. kind of using that symbolism there of a rock, which is void of human life, and the way that it happened. And it didn't happen in a dramatic way like you would read about or you would see in a movie. It just happened suddenly. There was no rhyme or reason to it. It didn't happen from him going out in a blaze of glory or jumping on a grenade or something like that. He died while he was relieving himself. And what could be more arbitrary and sudden than that? And I think obviously that's intentional on Tim O'Brien's part to reflect again how arbitrary and sudden death can be and how there's no rhyme or reason to it sometimes. And for many soldiers, they don't necessarily get the glory or the respect or the dignity in dying that they deserve. So um, I thought that was really interesting. Different characters, different reactions to Ted Lavender's death. Like Jimmy Cross feels guilty and responsible for it because at the time it happens, he's daydreaming about Martha. And then you get other characters' reaction in response to it. Kiowa, for example, he doesn't really feel anything at all, and to the point that he's almost disappointed in his own reaction to Ted Lavender's death, to where he describes it as being unchristian. And so I find that really interesting. That one character can't seem to get over it and is burdened by it, while another character, is just caught up in the normalcy of war to where this can happen to anyone at any given time. And in Kiowa's reaction, I find very interesting, and him being a Christian man, and he can't even find himself to come to tears or feel emotional about it. In fact, he feels just lucky to be alive. And then again, on the flip side, you have someone like Lieutenant Cross, who is so troubled by Ted Lavender's death that he decides to change as a leader at the end of the chapter because of it. He decides to burn Martha's letters as a way of having closure. Again, I think that symbolizes him distancing himself from the world back home, which has become a distraction for him, obviously, which is preventing him from doing his job as well as he thinks he can do it. And he decides to make a change as a leader moving forward to be better because of this situation and to carry himself in a different way as a leader. So I think that's a takeaway from this chapter too, is we're kind of as leaders questioning Lieutenant Cross's leadership ability, because for the beginning of the chapter he's completely consumed and obsessed with fantasies of Martha, to where it could possibly prevent him from doing his job as well as he could, to where at the end of the chapter, at least for me as a reader, I see Jimmy Cross in a completely different light, because he's willing to accept his failures as a leader, his own flaws as an individual, and he has a very important revelation and reflection at the end where he realizes that in order to do his job and carry it out to the best of his ability, he needs to distance himself from the world back home. He needs to have his complete and total attention and focus on his men around him that he's leading in the situation that he finds himself in. And so I think that's actually a very great quality in a leader, is being able to reflect and evaluate and assess your own ability in doing something, and recognizing what your flaws are and mistakes you've made and learning from them, and using those experiences, whether they be failures or not, as a way to grow as a leader and to become better moving forward. So just some takeaways that I have when I read the things they carried. I hope, if nothing else, you guys are at least just enjoying reading something that's creatively written in such a way. I think the concept of referring to the things they carried as a way to build character in the story, and also as a way to express the magnitude of war and what these soldiers burden themselves with, not only physically but mentally. It's just, I think, a genius way of, again, expressing in great detail, like, all the nuances of war, the magnitude of it, and how it affects individuals and human beings. So, again, I hope you're at least somewhat enjoying the story. Like I said in the class email and when I talk to you in person, we're not going to read this book in its entirety. We're just going to read select chapters in the weeks to come. You can expect to have questions that go with those chapters, and then we're going to have a couple of creative writing assignments that go with this book that I will explain in emails and class lectures to come. So I'll leave it at that. Hope you all are having a great week, and hope you're enjoying the classic Tim O'Brien novel, The Things They Carry.